one thing he was always leading up to his presidency and even through his presidency is Ronald Reagan was always underestimated.
Yes.
And I remember, of course, after the '76 campaign, the view in the political community, but particularly among the political press, was that Ronald Reagan was finished. That was his last hurrah. He would not be running for president again. If he wanted to, he was too old. Why was he always underestimated?
I don't know, but I know he was
very well.
Served him well, and he was always very aware of it. He knew it. He knew that he was always. He wrote in his diaries, he wrote in his letters that he was the Eastern press and the political establishment, and it showed up in the primaries too. Is that, for instance, the New Hampshire primary, which he won in a squeaker, 50 to 23%, over George Bush. As of the day of the primary, the media is writing too close to call. In November of 1980, which he wins in a squeaker by 9 million votes over Jimmy Carter, 51 to 41, and takes 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. The day of the election, the national media has got headlines saying too close to call. He was always aware of it. He used it to his advantage. I think that in politics there is an intelligentsia that thinks that there's some type of magical formula for becoming president of the United States, but everybody is part of the same village and they all talk to each other, and if you are outside of the village like Ronald Reagan and you approach things unconventionally, they don't see it.
I still remember the Carter White House, and I did a lot of reporting there. They were so glad when Ronald Reagan emerged as the Republican nominee, because they were worried about just that awesome juggernaut that they would face if Howard Baker emerged as the Republican nominee in 1980. You know, one thing you write in your book about 1980 is that if the schedule for the primaries, the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary, was like the schedule today, and unlike what it was in 1980, Reagan would not have won that primary and not the election. Explain that.
Yeah. Of course, he is, most of you know, he lost the Iowa caucuses. Huge upset to, at the time, somebody who was completely unknown in national politics was George Bush, then Ambassador Bush. And Bush had adopted the Carter game plan in Iowa. He was there assiduously writing thank you notes to everybody and going hither and yon, showing up in little coffee shops and showing up in living rooms, doing whatever he could. Now here's the irony, of course, is that Reagan was a hometown hero. He was Dutch Reagan, who had been on WHO radio in Des Moines all those years, was a local celebrity all through the 30s, had gone back there many times when he was with GE, and then later, in his political career. But his campaign manager, John Sears, is running an imperial campaign. Coming out of '76, Reagan is the front runner, although he's not as much as the front runner as people thought. He only had 28% of the support of Republicans nationwide as of December of 1979. And so hard charging Bush is spending all this time in Iowa. Then to add insult to injury is there was the famous Des Moines Register debate, which was televised live on 2 networks, was broadcast live on National Public Radio. 500 reporters went out to Iowa to cover it. No Ronald Reagan, because John Sears says, he told the media, he said, we can't allow people to think that Ronald Reagan is just like everybody else. So Reagan doesn't go, and he just plummets in the polls. He loses the Iowa caucuses, narrowly, but he loses them, and this is a huge, the political establishment is just stunned. Tom Pettit, who was then a reporter for ABC, in those days, networks devoted a lot of coverage to the primaries. And there was an election night special that night on ABC, and Tom Pettit said, we have just witnessed the political funeral of Ronald Reagan after his loss in Iowa. Reagan, the day after and in the succeeding days after, decides he's not going to listen to Sears anymore. And Reagan was always at his best. This is an important point we need to get into. When he took control of his own destiny, he told Sears, I'm not running anymore the way you want me to run. I'm going to run the way I want to run. I like meeting people. I'm going to New Hampshire. I'm in a campaign. Now, fortunately for Reagan, because after losing Iowa, his polls in New Hampshire had also collapsed. So he was just down, Bush, according to the Reagan polls, was ahead by 20 points in New Hampshire. He had the big mo, he had all this momentum, money's flooding into his campaign, he has lots of media attention. Today, the Iowa caucuses now fall 8 days after the New Hampshire primary. Then,
You mean the New Hampshire primary falls 8 days?
I beg your pardon, yes, the New Hampshire primary falls 8 days after the Iowa caucuses. Then, the New Hampshire primary fell 5 weeks after the Iowa caucuses. So Reagan was fortunate to have 5 weeks to reinvigorate his campaign, and he basically went to New Hampshire and stayed there. And what was interesting, maybe you were on the bus, Reagan was going 14 hours, 16 hours a day, loving every second of it. He's 69 years old, and reporters who were half his age, they finally were so exhausted at this pace being set by a man half his age, they hang a sign on the bus that says, "Free the Reagan 44."
Hey, Craig, who was the most interesting person you interviewed for the book? You interviewed hundreds of people.
Probably Walter Mondale. Probably Walter Mondale. I interviewed President Carter, former President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Walter Mondale, Jim Baker.
What was so interesting about Mondale?
Because he had great insight. He's a great politician. He had great insight. He told me, for instance, and this was in the book, Carter, of course, you remember, gave in July of '79 what is now infamously known as the Malay speech. And before he gave the speech, Mondale went to the president and he said, "Mr. President, you campaigned in this country in 1976 saying, we need a government as good as the American people. And you know what, Mr. President? You were right. Now you're saying we need that the government, that the American people aren't as good as their government, and that's wrong." Mondale was so offended by the speech and so opposed to it, he seriously considered resigning as vice president. That's how opposed he was. But he had great political insight. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We talked for 2 hours, and I ran out of questions, and he still wanted to talk. He had great insight into Reagan's appeal with Catholics, with blue-collar Democrats, with his performance in the debate with Carter, which, interestingly enough, again, the disconnect that we were talking about earlier, all the elites thought Jimmy Carter had won, but all the American people thought Ronald Reagan had won. But Mondale watched the debate, and he knew that it came 1 week before the election, and he knew it was over. He knew that Carter had lost the debate.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing you quote me in your book about, is being one of those elites who thought that Carter had won that debate. Carter was great with facts and so on, and I thought he won. After that, I was driving to Philadelphia because I was covering something up there as part of the presidential campaign, and on the way, I was listening to Larry King's radio show. I don't know whether he still has a radio show or not, but for years he was on radio, and everybody calling in. I mean, dozens and dozens of people as I was driving up there listening to it. They all called in. They hated Carter. They loved everything Reagan had said. And by the time I was halfway to Philadelphia, I had changed my mind.
But it was interesting because the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, CBS, they all, after the debate, proclaimed Jimmy Carter to be the winner. Then they started, doing their polls, Gallup and Harris and them, and the poll within 2 or 3 days came back showing Reagan not just winning as far as the American people were concerned, but by a substantial margin, as much as 20 points.